Thanks, Dr. Monson. We're really honored at the Maxwell Institute to work with the Office of Civic Engagement for this event today, and we're excited. I'm excited to introduce to you Dr. Spencer McBride. Dr. McBride earned his PhD in history at Louisiana State University. Currently, he is an associate managing historian of the Joseph Smith Papers Project at the Church Historical Department. He's an avid reader, writer, speaker, and podcaster. He published his first book entitled Pulpit and Nation in 2016 with the University of Virginia Press. His second book, Contingent Citizens, was published in 2020 by Cornell University Press. And his third book, with the foundation for his lecture today, Joseph Smith for President, was published earlier this year by Oxford University Press. Dr. McBride has written articles for several different scholarly journals, as well as op-eds for the Washington Post and Deseret News that illuminate current events with historical context. He was born and raised in California, now lives in Salt Lake City with his family. Please join me in welcoming Dr. McBride today.
See, I didn't want to take a seat, but I didn't know where to sit, so I should have had walk-up music like the pitchers in baseball do. I'm not sure what they would have played. Thank you for being here. I see many familiar faces and friendly faces. Familiar faces are good when they're friendly. I'm thankful to the Maxwell Institute and the Office of Civic Engagement for the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you. I wrote a book that when I tell people about it, the most common response is, I didn't know Joseph Smith ran for president. Show of hands, how many people knew that he ran for president? Now, keep them up if you knew what his campaign platform was. Okay, that's more than I usually get. Okay, good. Because I knew I had two audiences when I wrote this book. One was for Latter-day Saints, because many Latter-day Saints know he ran, but they don't really know why. They don't really know if he had a chance. Was he serious? And I wanted to answer those questions. But I wanted to write for a bigger, broader audience. And this meant keeping a certain questions in the front of my mind the entire time that I wrote this book. Because I wanted Latter-day Saints to read it, but I wanted more to read it. Because there's a story here. Why should somebody who doesn't really care about Joseph Smith as a religious leader care about his presidential campaign? Especially when, and sorry, spoiler alert, it had no chance of succeeding. But why should someone care about this story, even if it wasn't going to be successful? And there's a lot of ways to answer this, but one of the reasons we talk about unsuccessful, even unlikely presidential campaigns is because they usually offer a window into the discontent of a certain segment of the American population, a segment that believes that they are not being served well by the political status quo. And in the case of the United States, where we've always had a two-party system by the two major parties. But there's also an element to Joseph Smith's that helps us think through a really important question in our country's history. And that's the question of religious freedom. You see, there's myths that the United States was founded with universal religious freedom in the wake of the American Revolution. We love to say that. We love to celebrate that. And the United States did have a very high level of religious freedom at the time of its founding, but it was never universal. In fact, the state of Connecticut had laws regulating religion up till 1813, and the state of Massachusetts until 1833. Furthermore, and this is at the heart of Joseph Smith's campaign, this is kind of one of those I bet you didn't know, but it's actually a really important forgotten fact of our civic education. Prior to the American Civil War and the adoption of the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution did not apply to the individual states. They were designed by the framers to protect the rights of the people from infringement by the federal government. But if a state violated those rights, the federal government had no judicial standing to intervene and enforce those rights. So as much as we like to celebrate that the First Amendment had this freedom of religion clause, it meant that when the state of Missouri, let's see. There we go. When the state of Missouri expelled the Latter-day Saints, and you know this story, under threat of state-sanctioned extermination, the federal government could not intervene. And this is where Joseph Smith's political story begins. And that's what I want to do tonight, give you kind of the outline of why he ran for president, but then talk about what we can learn about religious freedom then and how we can apply it to our society today based on this story. You see, politicians then and politicians now, they have one thing, well, they have lots in common, but one thing that we see is they like to insist that they're not seeking power because they want power. It's common for a politician to say, I don't want to be a politician, but I'm running because the people have called me to run. And some of them might genuinely believe that. And some might actually be that virtuous political leader, but there's often people that use that same line to mask their own quest for power. My personal belief, being immersed in Joseph Smith's surviving documents, is that he was not a naturally political person. I believe he would have been content to lead his people in peace and even isolation if it were possible. But circumstances and desperation forced him to engage in the federal political system. And that engagement, in many ways, there we go, begins in November 1839 when Joseph Smith goes to Washington. I mean, that would be a great title of the book to go off Jimmy Stewart's movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I should have thought of that sooner. Too late now, I think. As the Latter-day Saints rebuilt their lives as religious refugees in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Elias Higbee take a church-sanctioned trip to Washington, D.C. to petition the federal government for $2 million in reparations for their lost property in Missouri. They wrote a 27-page memorial that spelled out everything that had happened to them in Missouri: the murders, the stolen property, the brutal rapes of Mormon women. And they had those affected by these persecutions swear out hundreds of affidavits itemizing all the lost property in Missouri. They could go to Congress and they had the receipts. This is what was taken from us. These were the days when you could knock on the White House door. Now, I am not advocating that any of you try that, okay? Because I don't think you can get very close today. But if you had the right congressman introducing you, you could knock on the White House door, and that's exactly what Joseph Smith does. And these were the days when President Martin Van Buren held almost daily receptions on the second floor of the White House, where supplicants could come and seek an audience with him. So sometimes, though, if you know the story about Joseph Smith and Martin Van Buren, we imagine it happening in the privacy of Van Buren's office, when the reality is they're in a crowded parlor, competing for face time. They finally get the president's face. They get his attention. They hand him some letters of recommendation from prominent officials in Illinois and Iowa. Van Buren reads one of them and he says, "What can I do? I can do nothing for you. If I do anything, I will come in contact with the state of Missouri." In essence, I'm up for re-election next year. It's going to be a close race. Missouri's one of the only states I can count on. If I come out in favor of you, I will lose the state of Missouri. I don't know what, if any, prejudice Martin Van Buren had for the Mormons. In this instance, his reasons for declining to help Joseph Smith were based on political calculus. What they were hoping Martin Van Buren would do, these were the days before executive orders were common, but if we read closely in the documents, they were hoping that the president would make a case in favor of Latter-day Saint reparations in his annual message to Congress, what we call today his State of the Union address. And so Joseph Smith and company, they're disappointed. They leave the White House and they turn their attention to Congress. They put their petition through the Senate. The Senate has an entire committee hearing of the Senate Judiciary Committee, not to determine whether the Latter-day Saints should get this $2 million, but does the federal government have any standing to intervene in the case? Do they have any jurisdiction in the case? And they unanimously decide that they do not. And this was based in part on Supreme Court precedents. The case of Barron v. Baltimore in 1833 ruled that the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states. A few years later, in 1845, in Promoli v. New Orleans, they'd get even more specific and say the Freedom of Religion Clause in Amendment 1 doesn't apply. But this is essential to understand of why Joseph Smith ran for president. Because he realized that the states' rights philosophy, the prevention of the federal government from intervening to help religious minorities, was preventing universal religious freedom in the United States. And so Joseph Smith goes back to Nauvoo and he builds a city designed to protect his people the best he can. He realizes, I can't depend on the federal government. He says, Illinois is treating us really well right now, but that could change. And, spoiler alert, it would. But he needed to have the laws and the civic government in place in Nauvoo to protect him and his people should those fail. And that's where we get what happens in Nauvoo. But moving on to 1843, sure enough, by the fall, things were looking bad. It looked like what had happened in Missouri was going to happen again in Illinois. And it's in this environment that the Latter-day Saints are looking at any recourse they can find. So in the back, I think I need your help in advancing the slide. There we go. And one more, please. Joseph Smith writes the same letter to the 5 men expected to run for president. These are beautiful pictures, by the way. I mean, look at the hairstyles. They had it going. So, John C. Calhoun, Martin Van Buren, Henry Clay, who wanted to be president more than anybody has ever wanted to be president in American history, Richard Mentor Johnson, and Lewis Cass. And they're all the same letter. They say, what will be your course of action as chief magistrate should fortune favor your election? Essentially, if you're elected president, how are you going to treat the Latter-day Saints? Are you going to protect our rights? Are you going to help us get redress and reparations? And the implication is the Latter-day Saints will vote for you as a bloc. Now, the Latter-day Saints were a political minority, but in Illinois, they were the kingmaker. The state was evenly divided between Whigs and Democrats. So whichever way the Latter-day Saints voted, that candidate would win Illinois and all of its electoral votes. Only 3 respond. Calhoun and Cass both write, hey, we sympathize with you. We're sorry that this has happened to you, but we don't think the federal government should be involved because of states' rights. Well, this irks Joseph Smith. He writes a scathing public letter against John C. Calhoun that implies the same for Cass. And this is just a personal opinion. I think his reaction to Henry Clay, I think he was a little more ticked off. Because Henry Clay writes like the most politician letter ever. He's saying, I sympathize with you, I feel for you, you know I'm a friend, but I don't want to make any promises. Because if I'm elected president, I don't want to be held to any of the promises I made. And so, again, just my personal opinion, I think this probably irritated Joseph Smith more than Cass and Calhoun. Cass and Calhoun made a principled stand. Now, Joseph Smith vehemently disagreed with that principle, right? But at least there was a principle there. And Joseph Smith writes a scathing rebuke of Henry Clay as well. And so by January 1844, the Latter-day Saints are saying, we can't support any of these men. And they decide we need to have an independent candidate for president, and that candidate should be Joseph Smith. Now, in the history of the United States, an independent candidate running outside the major political parties has never won and has never even come close to winning. But Joseph Smith had something that most independent candidates didn't. He had a corps of experienced missionaries who knew how to travel the country without purse or scrip and preach the gospel. And with the help of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, they raised volunteers, over 400 men, to go out and be electioneering missionaries. And they armed them with a political pamphlet called General Smith's Views. Oh, next slide, please. General Smith's Views on the Powers and... Oh, one more, please, I guess. There we go. General Smith's Views on the Powers and Policy of the Government of the United States. And he lays out his platform. Now, one issue drove Joseph Smith into the presidential campaign: constitutional reform so the federal government can be empowered to protect religious minorities when states fail to do so. But he wasn't a one-issue candidate. He opens the pamphlet by bringing up race. Joseph Smith laments that in a country that celebrates in its founding documents that all men are created equal, that some 2 or 3 million men, women, and children are denied freedom because, and these are his words, the color of the skin that covers their souls is different from ours. And he calls for the abolition of slavery, but he has a really unique, innovative idea of how to do this. He proposes that the federal government purchase the freedom of every enslaved man, woman, and child using the proceeds of the sale of Western lands, so that all these enslaved individuals will no longer be slaves. He calls for territorial expansion to annex Texas, which was the hot button issue of the day, to claim all of the Oregon country. As we mentioned, he called for the stronger federal government. He called for a new national bank, one that would serve to stabilize an economy that was going through severe cycles of severe bust and high booms. But then he also called for the, criminal justice reform, called for the closing of the country's penitentiaries, arguing that the system of criminal justice at the time, and tell me if this sounds familiar, punished crime in a way that did not reform the criminal. And the implication is that instead we were creating a permanent criminal class. Joseph Smith said we should build seminaries of learning instead of prisons, which is an early way of our modern statement, build schools, not prisons. And so Joseph Smith was driven into the election for one issue, but he was not a one-issue candidate. And he sent the missionaries throughout the country to distribute this. And in the book, there's some fun stories about this. In Boston, Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff are leading a political convention, and some hecklers come, and the police are called. And then fighting breaks out, not between the hecklers and the Latter-day Saints. The hecklers started fighting with the police. And the whole convention has to be delayed an entire day. In the South, the missionaries are surrounded in Tennessee by mobs, not because they were Mormon, but because it's illegal in Tennessee at this time to distribute anti-slavery literature. And Joseph Smith's presidential pamphlet was anti-slavery literature. So the goal was to elect him, and they did everything in their power. Samuel Brannan and others started a newspaper in lower Manhattan to promote his candidacy. And here's like the ultimate fun fact that's going to make you the biggest smash hit at your next dinner party, okay? It's just in time for, ahead of Thanksgiving. So Samuel Brannan had a printing press that he printed this Joseph Smith's campaign newspaper on. Later, a few years later, he would take that printing press on a ship around Cape Horn to San Francisco. And that same printing press would print the first published news of gold being discovered in California. But you can't wait for that dinner party, right? To wow your friends and family with that information. Next slide, please. Of course, we know how his campaign ends. His campaign ends with assassination. And it's a distinction nobody wants. Maybe someone grows up to say, I want to be president, but no one wants to be the first assassinated presidential candidate in American history. That's a distinction Joseph Smith had. But here's the asterisk next to that. There were political reasons for his assassination, mixed with religious prejudice. But from all that I've read and researched, no one was killing Joseph Smith to stop him from becoming president. The political concerns were local Illinois political concerns. So he has that distinction because he was running for president, but he wasn't killed to prevent him from becoming president. But all this begs the question, was Joseph Smith serious? And did he have a chance to win? I believe he was serious. And there's a few clues to that. And I think the most prominent is in every single state, they determined electors. They officially selected electors who would cast electoral votes should Joseph Smith get enough popular votes in any given state. Now, some of you have maybe only voted in 1 or 2 presidential elections. Some of you, I'm guessing, have voted in far more than that. And maybe with some political scientists in the room, I shouldn't ask this question, but how many of you know the names of the electors who cast the electoral vote in the presidential elections you voted in? Electors are political infrastructure. If this was just about PR, just about raising awareness of what was happening with the Latter-day Saints, there's no reason to pick electors, but they do. But I think there's a difference between was Joseph Smith serious and did he think he was going to win? Because I think there was an awareness on his part that he wasn't, at least not with any divine intervention. But if we're truly going to understand where this campaign fits, we have to look at the simultaneous actions that leaders in Nauvoo were taking. Because they saw one major problem, one major obstacle to universal religious freedom, and it was states' rights. Joseph Smith declared in the Nauvoo City Council, the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs. And then he declares to John C. Calhoun that Congress, with the president as its executor, should be as almighty in its sphere as Jehovah is in his. At the same time Joseph Smith is running for president, the Nauvoo City Council petitions Congress to make Nauvoo a federal city. In essence, to secede from Illinois, to have a status similar to Washington, D.C. What would this do? It would get around states' rights. It would put it directly under federal jurisdiction. At the same time, they petitioned Congress to make Joseph Smith a general in the Army, leading a 100,000-man volunteer army to protect Americans traveling west to Oregon. And by implication, would give him command of U.S. troops to defend the Saints in Nauvoo should mobs come against them. At the same time, they petitioned Congress to grant the Latter-day Saints a liberal tract of land worth $2 million, which is the same amount that they said they lost in Missouri, in the Western Territories where they could live and practice their religion in isolation. Again, they would get out of states' rights by being directly under federal authority. And at the same time, they entered secret negotiations with President Sam Houston of the Republic of Texas about potentially occupying the Nueces Strip, a contested strip of land between the Nueces and Rio Grande rivers that was contested between Mexico and the Republic of Texas. Sam Houston needed boots on the ground, and the Latter-day Saints were a good option because they came with their own militia. All these actions have one thing in common. They are trying to get around the states' rights doctrine. And I think that's essential to understanding Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. If it's just a PR stunt, it's an interesting PR stunt. But it's more than that. And this is often the case for religious minorities in American history. You throw whatever creative legal and political strategy you can against the wall and see what sticks. And in this case, none of them stuck. And after Joseph Smith is assassinated, Brigham Young and other church leaders quickly make up their mind that the time is soon approaching that they need to leave the United States altogether. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in conclusion, and before we hopefully have some good discussion and questions about the book, about religious freedom, I want to just bring up 2 things here. One, Joseph Smith was not the only person in the 1840s calling for the Bill of Rights to apply to the individual states. The other 2 most prominent people calling for that were Father Bernard Promoli, a Catholic priest in New Orleans who realized that the federal government needed to protect religious minorities. His case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. It's unsuccessful. And the Shakers of New York. Now, the Shakers were pacifist, and they held all their property in common. And New York had a law. If you're a man, you had to serve in the militia, and if you did not, you had to pay a $4 fine. But since the Shakers held all their property in common, they argued that that fine essentially amounted to a communal tax, a tax on a religious community based on their religious beliefs. And that led the Shakers to ask for the Bill of Rights to apply to individual states. And so there's something interesting about this. Joseph Smith and the Shakers and Father Bernard Promoli, these were not legal scholars. These were not men and women trained in the law. They were merely the leaders of religious minority groups who looked around and said, we love our country, but there's something wrong when we can be mistreated like this, and the federal government says, we can't help you. Joseph Smith wasn't advocating getting rid of states' rights altogether, but having a federal government powerful enough to intervene when it had to. Lastly, the question, was Joseph Smith right that the states' rights doctrines were what feed mobs? In one way he was, in another way maybe not. The states' rights doctrine wasn't the sum total of the problems of religious freedom in the United States. There was bigotry. There was prejudice. And if we look at what happens with Brigham Young coming out to the Utah territory, anyone who knows that history knows that getting under federal authority did not solve all of the Latter-day Saints' problems. In fact, a whole new set of problems came into Brigham Young's life. And so it was not the only obstacle. But consider also this as an answer to, did the states' rights doctrines feed mobs? David Atchison, who the Latter-day Saints knew as one of the militiamen who drove the Latter-day Saints out of Missouri in 1838, in 1854 was a sitting United States senator. And he wrote a letter to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, about a new, quote-unquote, unwanted political minority in Missouri. Not a religious minority, abolitionist. Missouri was a slave state, and as slave owners and anti-slavery advocates were flooding into Kansas and Nebraska to try to determine whether those states would be free or slave states, they were spilling over into Missouri. And Missouri's political leadership did not want them there. So David Atchison writes a letter to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. And it's funny where you find these things. I would have never found this letter if I wasn't reading a biography of Jesse James. That's where it is. And David Atchison writes, "We are organizing to meet their organization. Before it is all over, we will be forced to burn, shoot, and hang. We intend to Mormonize them." In the 1830s, Missouri dealt with an unwanted minority group through extra-legal mob violence. They had done it and they had gotten away with it. 1854, faced with another unwanted minority group, they turned to the same strategy, but now they've named it after that first group. They've turned Mormon into a verb for mob violence to expel unwanted groups out of their states. Did the states' rights doctrines feed mobs? In this case, they absolutely do. So what does this have to do with religious freedom today? I think one of the major messages of Joseph Smith's story is the fight for religious freedom is, at its core, a fight against prejudice, bigotry, and misunderstanding. But in addition to that, it's about the systems, the laws, the policies that embolden and uphold that prejudice. The states' rights doctrines have nothing to do with religion on their surface. On their surface, they are religiously benign. But in their implementation, they had a discriminatory effect. And so the question for us, if we are fighting for universal religious freedom, yes, we need to fight against bigotry and prejudice and misunderstanding. Are there laws that we support that on the surface have nothing to do with religion, but in their implementation have a discriminatory effect? Are there politicians that applies to as well? Are there systems that uphold religious inequality the same way that there are systems that uphold racial inequality? That, I think, is the core message of Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. He ran for president because he understood this, and he died as a victim of mob violence. So that's my presentation for you today, but I look forward to hearing your questions, your comments, and talking about this more thoroughly with you. So should we...
Yeah. So I have a microphone that I'll bring to you if you have a question. Yeah, let's start with Judge Davis. I probably don't need a mic, but...
No one's ever accused me of being too quiet, of all the things they've called me.
Well, you've never been before me in felony court. I want to make a record in connection with that. But here's my question as it relates to your book. Do other historians that are not associated with the church, et cetera, what has been their response? What have they viewed as it relates to this? Or have you gotten any feedback from others and sort of that source?
Yeah, you know, Joseph Smith's presidential campaign has been relegated really to kind of the curiosity file of American history, right? Like, did you know he ran for president? It's interesting. Yes, he wasn't going to win, didn't really have a chance, and so sometimes people dismiss those as insignificant because their prospects were slim. And my goal is hopefully to not try to argue that he was going to win, but to say this is why the campaign still matters. I hope that we see people take it seriously. I think one sign, and maybe this is just because he's a friend of mine, one of my good friends, he's a professor out in Tennessee, and he's writing a history of the election of 1844. And while it focuses on the main players, and guys, the one person who wins in 1844 wasn't even on Joseph Smith's list when he wrote To Those Five Men. James K. Polk kind of came out of nowhere. But he's included a chapter on dark horse candidates where he talks about James G. Birney, who was the candidate of the Anti-Slavery Liberty Party in 1844, and Joseph Smith. And so at least in this new forthcoming book on the election of 1844, Joseph Smith gets the better part of a chapter, which may be about what the right proportion in an overall history of that election, if that makes sense. So hopefully that's a sign of more to come, that people consider this when they write about that election. We'll see. Thank you.
There, okay, that's the hand I saw.
Sorry, I'm one of the people who got a copy of your book. I was just curious. You mentioned the $2 million number. That's not far off from what Jefferson paid for the entire Louisiana Purchase. Was the $2 million actually $2 million, or was that updated for modern sensibilities? Was it adjusted for inflation?
Great question. That's an approximation. They actually added up all the affidavits, and they didn't give the specific number. They rounded to approximately 2 million. I think the number comes to a little over 2 million, but that's $1844.
Yeah.
One of the interesting questions in that calculation, and I haven't done this, and it's kind of one of those one-day research projects, is were they taking into account preemption rights? Now, this may seem like getting into the weeds, but one of the big deals about the property that the Saints lost in Missouri is they couldn't technically own title to it yet. But the way it worked is you could pay what was called the entry price of land as if there was no improvement on it. And then 3, 4, 5 years later, when it became officially for sale by the federal government, you then had first dibs, essentially. You could go purchase it. Now, maybe you'd built a home and you'd built a barn, which would make the land more valuable. You could still buy it from the federal government at that price, what was called the entry price, if there was no construction, no improvements. I don't know the extent to which that factored into the Latter-day Saints calculations. It's kind of one of those open questions in my mind. But yeah, that 2 million figure is in $1839. Great question.
Would you care to perform an visual exegesis of your cover? All of the relevant forces that go into a fact of a scene like that or a portrayal of a scene like that relevant to your topic?
Yeah, I think so. The way with a book too, as many of you know, ultimately I don't get to have final say on the cover, but my press designs it, and if I like it, they're happy. If not, they're willing to talk. One of the reasons we really liked this cover, this is a painting from the 1880s called General Smith's Final Address, or something to that extent. This is him in his Nauvoo Legion uniform, addressing the Nauvoo Legion there in the Nauvoo Temple. The temple actually wasn't quite that finished as it is in that painting. But the image shows Joseph Smith not simply as a religious leader, but also as a civic leader. Yes, he's a dark horse candidate running without any major state or federal experience. But this is a time when people often rose from community militias to those positions. And so part of our thinking in this was showing Joseph Smith in his militia attire highlights that he wasn't just a religious leader running for office, but he also had these civic responsibilities. Here's something I didn't realize until one of my kids pointed it out. My first book has a chaplain in the Continental Army during the Revolution walking out of a church building holding up a hymn book in that kind of same gesture. And now I have Joseph Smith holding up a sword. I hope I'm not held to that same pattern for every subsequent book cover that I do.
But 40 years previous, when the events are happening, as opposed to this respective portrayal, there is Joseph as Major General, there is uniform going on here, were potential voters conscious and leery of the fact or admiring the fact?
Yeah, so the question is, were people leery, excited? How did they react to someone in militia attire who held the offices Joseph Smith had? How did they respond to his candidacy for president? And many were leery. They were worried because they didn't think Joseph Smith was going to win, but his campaign raised a specter. What happens when a religious leader seeks public office? What are the dangers of that? And for someone like Joseph Smith, who led a minority group and seemed to have a concentration of power in him as mayor, as lieutenant general of the Legion, as president of the church, this worried a lot of Americans. Again, they weren't worried that he was going to win, but the prospect of someone else like him could win in the future was not so foreign a concept. And those that did write about that wrote in negative and worried tones in newspapers.
Okay, I have one here on this row, and then I have one in the back, and then I'll come here, and then we might have one more after that.
You mentioned in your book that Joseph Smith believed in the American founding myth, and he specifically marked the election of Martin Van Buren as the turning point for when America went downhill.
Yeah.
Was there any reason for this besides Joseph's personal experience with the president?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you caught on that because it's politicians for a long, long time have talked about American decline, and their candidacy is going to restore it to what it should be. And you press any one of them to tell you exactly when the country began to decline, and they hem and they haw, and they can't tell you. Joseph Smith could tell you an exact date, and that's the inauguration of Martin Van Buren. But I think that's very personal to Joseph Smith. He never forgot what he felt was the slight. Because here's the fascinating thing in his political pamphlet. He praises Washington, Adams, Jefferson, all the way through Jackson, and then says the decline began. But in 1833, when the Latter-day Saints were expelled from Jackson County, Missouri, they petitioned the Jackson administration for help. And it was Jackson's Secretary of War, Lewis Cass, who responded that the federal government can do nothing. So for all that Joseph Smith put on Van Buren's administration, the facts actually say, well, Jackson wasn't willing to help either. But Jackson was this larger-than-life hero in frontier America at this time. And I can't prove this, but my suspicion is to go after Jackson the same way he went after Van Buren was off limits. you were going to sink your cause from the beginning. I mean, there were some who went after Jackson, but it was counterintuitive to Joseph Smith's goals. And he took very personally what Van Buren had declined to do. And so, yeah, that's now you know the rest of the story, as they used to say. So, good question. Thank you.
I'm gonna take the host prerogative and ask a question, Spencer. And my question is going to turn us to modern times a little bit. I want you to think about the implications of what you write about in this book for political controversy and conflict related to minority groups that aren't religious minorities, but in particular thinking about controversy over sexual orientation and how it conflicts with religion. What are the lessons from Joseph Smith's presidential candidacy, and can they be applied to those controversies today in some way that you find fruitful?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the overarching messages of Joseph Smith's quest for religious freedom is that if you're only fighting for your own religious freedom, which is easy, right? You're not really fighting for religious freedom. Religious freedom for some is not religious freedom. It has to be for all. And Joseph Smith passes a city ordinance in Nauvoo to that effect, allowing the worship of Jews and Muslims in Nauvoo. Now, how many actually came to Nauvoo to test that? Not a lot, but in theory, at least in law, they could. But you also see, and sometimes Latter-day Saints come to me and they want to know what Joseph Smith would be today. Would he be a Democrat or a Republican? Or maybe they want to know about his political views in the same way that they might want to know his doctrinal views. And to this I say, Joseph Smith's positions in 1844 don't necessarily fit with our political sphere today. But if you're looking for something that's there, that we can look to in our own day, I think it's the compassion for the marginalized. How do we make sure that the American system works for everybody? Not just the majority, not just the privileged few. How does it work for everybody? And one of the things that I think comes of this, that I think of for my own efforts to help make the country work for everybody, and with religious freedom, but also with different minority groups, is I don't have to agree with you to allow and facilitate you to live with full rights. Joseph Smith believed that the church he led was the actual church of Jesus Christ restored on the earth. But he saw no problem in facilitating the worship and protecting the worship of Catholics and Presbyterians and Methodists and Jews and Muslims. It was essential, actually, if universal religious freedom was going to be present. And so this is something, it doesn't make the answers to these questions easy. But if we're talking about equal rights, we have to think beyond ourselves. We have to think beyond our own groups. We have to think about people who are different than us. There was a time, today Latter-day Saints are not chased by mobs. I'm not saying we're fully in the mainstream, but it's a whole lot easier to be a Latter-day Saint in the United States today than it was back then. But do we forget what it was like for those who went before us? Do we make sure that the rights we wish that Joseph Smith and others were afforded in the 1840s are given to other groups today? And how can we make that work in a way that is fair to all? These are open questions, but we have to ask them, and there's ambiguity throughout. But if we're going to be smart college grads who go into the world, we need to be okay with complexity and ambiguity and questions that aren't answered very easily. All right.
So from the pamphlet that you had showed us earlier, the 5 points that were put up there, I found it really interesting because they all seemed like things that we have put in place today. So like the Bill of Rights applying to the states, having a strong federal government, even something like having the Federal Reserve, so a strong national bank as well. So all of those seem like very forward-thinking, sort of like Da Vinci-esque, way ahead of his time sort of positions. How do you feel that Joseph Smith's policies related to his place as the prophet of the Lord? Do you think he saw ahead and knew what was coming because of that, or were they more personal opinions?
Yeah, so as a believing Latter-day Saint myself, it's entirely plausible that his prophetic role influenced his campaign platform. Standing here as a historian looking at what's written down in sources, I think Joseph Smith is at least, if not entirely, looking at nationally relevant issues but also personal experience. He had been in prison. His father had been in debtor's prison. He calls for the end of imprisonment for debt. He had a personal experience with that. His views on race and slavery were evolving, as so many of our own views evolve with time. Joseph Smith is speaking from personal experience on nationally relevant issues as well. And another thing that is really hard to parse out is he relied on his scribe William W. Phelps. And now some people like to just, when Joseph Smith says something they don't like, they just blame it on Phelps. He's the ghostwriter, but that's not the way their relationship worked. Joseph Smith read every word of that pamphlet and approved it. To what extent was the articulation Phelps? Were the ideas Phelps and Smith's together? That remains unknown. As a historian, I trace them more to his personal experience and national relevance. As a believing Latter-day Saint, I leave it open to the possibility that there is divine inspiration at play as well. But I can't quantify or prove that.
Okay, our last question.
First, thanks so much for your presentation, Dr. McBride.
My pleasure.
You brought up earlier this notion that First Amendment religious freedom rights did not apply to states in these days, and we saw the Supreme Court cases that where justices certainly believe that. But can you weigh in at all on sort of popular constitutionalist views, right? When Joseph Smith and the Nauvoo City Council scatter the type of the expositor, and they say, listen, there's a states' rights thing, it doesn't apply. No one else in Illinois seemed to agree with them. So was Joseph Smith's sense that religious freedom should be guaranteed through the states as well? Did others share that even if they didn't agree that Mormonism was a religion?
Great question. Missouri's state constitution allowed for religious freedom. And in the case of the expulsion of the Latter-day Saints, they just weren't enforcing it. On the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor, I'm going to defer to President Oak's book. Before he was serving as a general authority, he wrote on the assassination and trial of the accused in Carthage, called Carthage Conspiracy. He knows that law a whole lot better than I do. But there was debate of whether the destruction of a public nuisance, as the expositor was deemed, was in compliance with law, and lawyers could go back and forth on whether it was. But one thing we see is that even with the 14th Amendment, which allows the Bill of Rights to apply to the individual states, Supreme Court justices are still human, and they still deal with their products of their times. It is not until the 1920s and 1930s that the Supreme Court consistently enforces the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom in cases involving individual states. It takes that long, even after the mechanism is put in place. And I think that's not all that different from what Brigham Young found, right? Just because they got away from states' rights doesn't mean that the prejudice was gone. And just because the 14th Amendment was in place didn't mean that the Supreme Court automatically started enforcing the First Amendment's freedom of religion clause. Does that make sense?
It does. I guess I felt I had a different question, but
Oh.
I understand if we don't have time.
Well, I'm sorry if I misunderstood. I'd love to chat with you after to make sure I can answer it right.
The good news is that Dr. McBride has agreed to stick around to address these kinds of questions. Before we give him a hand to thank him, let me just remind those of you that signed up to get a free copy of the book that there's a discussion group to come to. That you should have had an email that told you at least the day and time. They're Friday afternoon or Monday afternoon. You'll get another follow-up with a Zoom link because these are being held on Zoom. But just don't forget to come to those. And let's join me in thanking our guests today.